Hey everybody, welcome to this week's podcast.
Hello there.
We apologize for the lack of videos, the lateness in this video, just, life.
Both working full-time.
Yeah, I'm in school full-time as well, and then we have other things sort of on the go, but we're trying to keep a fairly regular schedule, so just bear with us. This week we are going to be talking about residential schools. In particular, one residential school in Ontario. At the time it was called St. Anne's Indian Residential School, and it was in Fort Albany, Ontario. And the reason that we're doing it is because an article that I just came across, it was dated October 12th. 2023, and it was on the CBC website.
So the Ontario Provincial Police have laid 3 gross indecency charges against a 97-year-old Ottawa woman, alleging she was involved in sexual assaults in the 1960s and 70s in Northern Ontario residential and day schools. So the accused is Françoise Seguin. She was a nun with the Sisters of Charity of Ottawa, who worked at St. Anne's Indian Residential School in Fort Albany, Ontario between 1958 and 1968. Seguin's name appears on a list of nuns who worked at St. Anne's, which the sisters provided the OPP in 1994 after the force opened a police probe into sexual and physical abuse allegations in the institution.
So imagine that at 97 years old, thinking that you've gotten away with it all of this time, and then all of a sudden, ding dong, police are at your door, and you're arrested and you're being charged. So
there were 5 criminal convictions of former staff due to recent hearings with sentencing ranging from house arrest to 18 months in jail. 2 former nuns were convicted, however no priests or bishops were convicted, as most had died before or during those trials. So residential school education was intended to convert Indigenous children to Christianity, to strip them of their culture, values, and social behaviors, and to westernize them. Missionaries and European settlers who saw Indigenous people as savages believed Western civilization was superior, which... I'm not going to go there, actually.
I mean, you could. You're not going to...
I don't know if I can eloquate the words right now.
It's just a shame they felt the need to do that, because there's nothing at all wrong with the way the Indigenous people were living.
So Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their family homes and sent to live in these boarding schools, completely alienated from their families. Earlier schools were segregated according to gender, which meant siblings were further separated from each other. So they were just torn away from everyone they knew in any respect and thrown together in these schools.
But for the most part, children were just more or less just taken.
So they had to adhere to strict daily schedules that involved mostly physical labor. Children were also forbidden to speak their own languages.
Yep, and they would be severely punished if they did speak their language.
And there were more than 130 residential schools and 699 day schools in Canada between 1830 and 1994.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And that's a long time, too.
It's a lot. Yep.
1830, 1994, that's 164 years. Residential schools.
Yes.
And the amount of those children who died needlessly.
I'd watched another interview with another survivor from this school in particular again. He said that he attended the school, and when he was older, he stayed on and worked at the school as a young caretaker. and he remembers many, many, many bodies being buried on the school grounds. And years later, when the OPP did an investigation, which would have been 1994, during his interview, he had actually pointed out and made a map where he remembers bodies being buried. So years later, when they had ground penetrating radar, I think it was in 2020, they ended up using it on the grounds of this school, and everywhere that he said that he remembered there being burials, they had found just layers of bodies. So, and that's just at this school.
Now imagine that in any other school, discovering that children were buried.
It's disgusting. And unfortunately, it wasn't anything that we ever learned about. Actually, I can say probably for the majority of people, they didn't hear or know anything about residential schools, let alone all of this, until maybe the past 5-6 years. So, I mean, that was another reason why we thought it was important to start talking about it. Just keep the conversation going.
So St. Anne's was opened in 1902, directed by the Oblates of Mary Immaculate and the Grey Nuns of the Cross. Only a small shack remains of St. Anne's today. The school, the nuns' residence, and the rectory burned down separately over the past 15 years. So Indigenous children in the surrounding communities, such as the Atawapiskat First Nation, Constant Lake First Nation, and Fort Severn First Nation, were forced to attend the school. Psychological abuse began with the act of taking the children away from their families and community, and the abuse continued within the school. Now, the Ontario Provincial Police conducted a 6-year investigation which began November 9th, 1992, after Fort Albany First Nation Chief Metatawabin presented evidence to police following a healing conference attended by St. Anne survivors. In 6 years, the OPP interviewed 700 victims and witnesses and gathered 900 statements about various assaults, suspicious deaths, and other abuses that occurred at St. Anne's between 1941 and 1972.
So the Federal Justice Department obtained the OPP files from the investigation in 2003 after a group of St. Anne survivors filed an abuse lawsuit in Cochrane, Ontario against Ottawa and the Catholic entities that ran the school. The case ended with a settlement. But from 2008 to 2014, the federal government omitted references to the OPP investigation during settlement agreements and reconciliation with residential school survivors. A 2014 ruling from the Ontario Superior Court forced the Stephen Harper government to disclose the OPP files and documents to St. Anne survivors. So what had happened was, basically in a nutshell, the OPP turned their files over to the federal government, and the federal government edited a lot of the narration from the survivors. So there was a bit of a fight that went on for a while to get the original OPP files sent back to the OPP or to the survivors. Provincial police files is the raw evidence gathered from survivors and witnesses that had never been shared with the public until recently. The survivors say the federal government has a history of reluctant, contradictory, and inconsistent disclosure of documentation of abuse in residential schools. So now I'm going to get into a little bit of the narration. Again, we don't get into very nasty details, but I'm just giving you the heads up. This is a narration of some of the survivors, and I've edited them as best I could without losing the integrity of what they're saying. One survivor described a straitjacket in a 1994 interview. She told investigators it was a grayish-beige color and made from tough material, with zippers down the back and front. The sleeves had fringes to bind the arms together, They also stated that sometimes students were tied to the bed. Nuns, priests, and lay brothers would hit students with large straps, small whips, beaver snare wire, boards, books, rulers, yardsticks, fists, and open hands, survivors told investigators. Sometimes students were locked away in a dark basement for hours at a time, which must have been absolutely horrifying.
As if they didn't go through enough already.
Yeah. They also told investigators about being force-fed porridge, spoiled fish, cod liver oil, and rancid horse meat that made students physically sick. So, I mean, they weren't even getting nutrition, obviously.
The worst treatment of any kind.
There were numerous allegations of sexual abuse involving nuns, priests, lay brothers, and other staff, ranging from fondling and forced kissing to violent acts and nighttime molestation. One survivor, who was in her 50s at the time of her August 1993 interview with OPP investigators, said she remembered a staff member who targeted 5 girls for sexual abuse during her time at St. Anne's, which lasted from 1951 to 1955. The survivor, who began attending the school at age 11, said the staff member would take a different girl every night. So it's awful.
Just treating them however they wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. Under the guise of trying to make the savages better people, this is happening. And by this time, these schools were also government funded. So, I mean, keep that in mind. Did the government know what was happening back then? I have a feeling that they did. And they treated it like a business, basically, as did the churches.
Yep, and they just, anything they probably would have heard about, they just swept under the rug.
Beatings and bullying were encouraged by clergy, and attacks by older students against younger students were always ignored. The police report is filled with statements claiming school staff actively participated in or facilitated student-on-student physical and sexual abuse. Student abusers were often themselves abused. So the student abusers were obviously in the school since they were children, and I guess when they hit a certain age, 13, 14 years old, they, by that time they must have been severely abused and manipulated and controlled to where they were doing this even to their own younger siblings, which is, it's just disgusting. I just don't even know how else to explain it. PP transcripts and reports. The description of an electric chair varied, but appeared to have been used between the mid to late 1950s and the mid 1960s. Some said it was metal, while others said it was made of dark green wood, like a wheelchair without wheels. They all said it had straps on the armrests and wires attached to a battery. Survivors described the scary feeling of being strapped into the electric chair and the painful feeling of being shocked, sometimes 2 or 3 times in a row, even sometimes until the child passes out. It was usually one of the brothers that would inflict this punishment. So, man of the cloth doing it. Why they feel the need to use an electric chair in a school?
You could definitely see where it got to a point where it's almost like they enjoyed doing this.
Yeah, there's a number of survivors that remember being bullied or beat up or assaulted and The teachers, the nuns, would just be standing there watching, some giggling or smiling or just pretending to ignore. Many children were told to sit in the chair if they ever wanted to see their family again, which was probably never going to happen anyway. But the children were so hopeful to see their family again, they would sit in the electric chair and take it. That's a big sacrifice for a child. There were also stories about the passing of a boy who fell from a swing in 1933. Another boy drowned after falling through the ice while skating in the early 1940s. One survivor told police investigators that a boy was beaten to death in the 1940s or 50s for stealing a communion wafer.
He was probably just hungry.
Definitely. You'd have to put yourself in the position of the child. First of all, it's unfamiliar environment. This is Northern Ontario. First Nations communities in Northern Ontario. This is not they're not used to such structure. This strange religion.
Such
food.
Extreme, punishments, too.
Punishments, punishments. Strange food.
Being taken advantage of.
Right. So there's a lot going on here. Then there was the disappearance of 3 boys. John Kyoki, 14, and Michael Matinas, 11, both from Attawapiskat, and Michael Sutherland, 13, from Wimisk. They were sick of being beaten, and they escaped. The 3 boys ran away from St. Anne's with a 4th boy at about 5 a.m. on April 19, 1941. The 3 boys had planned this escape for quite a long time. They shared their plans with the other students. They gathered leftovers from meals to store away in a flour bag that they hid for their escape. The boys also had a bow and 10 arrows to hunt rabbits if needed. Another group of 5 boys ran away from the school 3 hours after the first group of 3 boys. They returned back to the school after another student caught up with them and told them that a priest had noticed they were gone and ordered them back. So I imagine they got punished.
Yeah.
St. Anne's staff member was later sent out to look for the 3 missing boys, but turned back after it got dark. A storm hit on the second day of searching. The RCMP and Indian Affairs official were not informed of the boys' disappearance until weeks later, on June 6, 1941. So, the school failed to let the police know and let Indian Affairs know about these missing boys.
So that's 2 months later.
Yes. Yeah. So, I guess they just were... Obviously, they had a number of things to hide. Yes. But had they just... I'm glad the boys got away. I'm not saying I would have preferred the boys go back, but, it just... Imagine a school not letting anybody know that your children were missing for, until 2 months later. Eventually, some of the local Cree who were out hunting said they came across a small wigwam and arrows about 16 kilometers away from the Sickening River. The boys were assumed to have drowned. Their bodies were never recovered. And still to this day, this is a mystery. We do not know what happened to these boys. None of the survivors have any idea. They definitely said the boys were not brought back to the school. There were not bodies found in the forest or in the water, so that's no idea. No idea. In 1994, the survivors interviewed by the OPP spoke about the attempted unalivings and struggles with addictions in their adulthood, or refers to intergenerational trauma. So, intergenerational trauma was first detected in the children of Holocaust survivors. Researchers have also noted its effects after Khmer Rouge killings in Cambodia and the Rwandan genocide. Basically, what it is if you have ancestors or older relatives who went through a very distressing or oppressive event, their emotional and behavioral actions could ripple through the generations of your family and affect you. This is called intergenerational trauma. You might also hear it called generational trauma, historical trauma, or multi-generational trauma. So, there were a number of sad cases with the survivors of St. Anne's Residential School. A lot of addiction. A lot of the survivors didn't make it far into their adulthood. But there are some that are still with us today. It, like I said, it reflects definitely in the community, in their family structure. Usually it's passed down. Substance abuse and addictions and depression and anger. Some of you might have gone through it with your own family or know people that have this sort of pattern in their family where certain characteristics and traits are passed down through the generations, and it can affect you in many ways aside from health and mental health, also financially. There's a lot that can happen, and it usually takes about 6 to 7 generations before intergenerational trauma can be healed or begin to heal. And that's a fact. As mentioned earlier, OPP investigators identified 74 suspects and charged 7 people. 5 were convicted. So now 6 convicted with the story we were talking about earlier with the 97-year-old nun. The 5 people convicted included Anne Wesley, a Cree nun born in Attawaspakat, who attended St. Anne's as a child. She was convicted of 3 counts of common assault, 3 counts of administering a noxious substance, and 1 count of assault causing bodily harm. She received an 11-month conditional sentence. So,
just even to think,
not much.
Yeah. And even out of 74 suspects, 7 people were charged, but only 5 were convicted. It's like the number just gets smaller every time a step is taken. Like,
yeah, well, don't forget, some of the worst perpetrators were the brothers or priests, and a lot of them passed away before it came to this point, and also I believe there was 1 or 2 that passed away during the trial, like not in court, but during the entire process. So Jane was an Ojibwe nun born in Ogoki Post, Ontario, who as a child attended the Macintosh Indian Residential School north of Vermilion Bay, Ontario. So another one who was in a residential school that ended up being an abuser themselves. She was convicted of 3 counts of assault causing bodily harm. She was given a 6-month conditional sentence. So 6 months conditional sentence.
For all the horrors those children had to face.
Yeah. I mean, years. There's some justice here, but still doesn't seem right. Next is John Moses Rodriguez. or Roderick, a cook and later employed by Indian Affairs, pleaded guilty to 5 counts of indecent assault. He was sentenced to 18 months in jail. So he actually went to jail. He was a cook there, not even clergy, just a worker who also worked for Indian Affairs after, so terrible. Next was Claude Lambert, a child care worker at St. Anne's. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of indecent assault and was sentenced to 8 months in jail. So he went to jail because he pled guilty to 1 count. I guess they figured that was enough, but if he was found guilty, he might have spent a little bit more time in prison, I would assume. I should say jail. Less than 2 years is jail. More than 2 years is prison, so in jail. Last of the 5 is Marcel Blais, who worked in the kitchen, pleaded guilty to 1 count of indecent assault on a male. He did not receive jail time, and I could not find out why. Terrible story, but definitely should be talked about a lot more. Like I mentioned earlier, many people just don't know about the details, and I didn't even touch on a lot of the details. I'm going to link a lot of my sources in the description of the video if you'd like to see for yourself, but again, obvious heads up, it's extremely hard to read some of the articles, so I'll make sure that I sort of point those out as well in case you just don't want to see, or if you just want some general information about intergenerational trauma or residential schools. I'll just put some general links in there too. But thank you for joining us this week.
Thank you very much.
We're definitely going to keep on this topic as much as possible. It's pretty heavy duty, so we're going to spread it out a little bit. But thank you for joining us, and we will see you in the next video. Bye, guys.
Bye.